All right, let's kick things off here. Thank you for joining us on this webinar Wednesday on how to integrate on-court rehab alongside training room goals. So today's objectives, we're going to establish some common goals between on and off court, right? A lot of what we do relative to working with athletes, at some point, athletes want to get back to being on court or being on the soccer field, wherever you may be. So we're going to talk about how can you create the common goals between weight room, training room, and on court so that they all fall in line together. We're going to talk about some key variables that are important when designing certain drills that are on court. And we're going to get into a little bit on the weeds on that and really make it simple, though, so that way you can start having conversations with your athletes, with your high school coaches, college coaches, pro teams, wherever you may be, understanding what you're trying to get out of a session from a rehab perspective and how the coaching staff can leverage some of those variables and give them some creativity to work within as well. That leads into our discussion around drill selection, matching exercise selection. So a lot of these variables that we're going to talk about are going to indicate what type of physical adaptation we're trying to chase. Speed, power, strength, endurance, how we manipulate certain variables are going to change the physical demands that we're asking our athletes to do. And then we're going to get into some case studies and practical strategies that you can start using today. Listen, if you've been on these webinars before, I'm someone that still works in the clinic day to day. I've got athletes, I have clients. Listen, you probably are doing the same thing. We all want to walk away with something practical. Theory is great, and it's a great thing for understanding knowledge and education. But ultimately, you should be able to walk out of here today knowing, okay, if I have a conversation with a coach or a player tomorrow, I can start doing X. And so that's what I hope to get to for you by the end of it. And certainly, we'll round things out with a live Q&A. Quick housekeeping for those that are some late joiners here. On the right side, there's a chat room. Feel free to throw some questions in there. There's also a free handout for you to download just for a little thank you for joining us today. Just as it's important we highlight the expectation of what this is, let's just briefly talk about what this will not be. This will not be some sort of injury protocol or post-op protocol. There's plenty of resources for that. We're going to talk about frameworks and principles that you can leverage to work alongside many of those common protocols or common injury rehab plans. There isn't going to be a bunch of video demonstrations of sport-specific skills or how to run this drill or that drill, right? Because ultimately, you're going to be limited by number of players, number of staff, your environment, your resources. So rather than giving you something that may not apply, let's give you the tools to be able to create what it is that you need. And like I said, it's not going to be just theory. It's very important that we give you something practical here. So for those of you who have never met me before, my name is Dr. Adam Loiacono, Doctor of Physical Therapy, board certified sports clinical specialist, and performance coach. Worked across professional soccer, men's and women's, and then also the NBA across 2 different teams. First half of my career, really spent a lot of time on the soccer side. I was actually a Division III soccer coach early in my career, and then went the whole gamut of youth soccer coach, college soccer coach, fitness coach, sports scientist, performance therapist, director of rehab, director of performance, all along this 15-year journey to get me where I am now, to be able to bring all these experiences to UNA and share the tools and frameworks that help me be successful along the way. So again, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited that you're here. So let's talk about a little bit of an introduction here and get into a little bit more of why you're here and what we're going to learn. So it's very important we connect rehab with on-court performance. And the big reason for that is our goal is always to get athletes back on the court as quick as we can, get them integrating the ball as soon as they can, working on their technical skill, working on their tactical skill. But the question becomes, how do we transition from the rehab, from the training room, from the weight room, sorry, tongue twister there, from the weight room into the court? How do we integrate physical, technical, tactical, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that. How do we systematically progress on-court rehab? We know how to do sets reps. We know how to do volume. We know how to do intensity. We know how to do percentage of max, velocity-based training, max aerobic speed, whatever is in your wheelhouse for progressions in the training room and the weight room. We're very good at that as performance physical therapists or athletic trainers or performance coaches. Then the question becomes, how are you just as good as periodizing programming on-court drills? That's a question that we're all here to learn and answer about. So we're going to get into that. Then we're going to talk about how we can integrate the tactical with the physical. Having a background, having been a collegiate soccer coach, having been a college soccer player, running youth academy sessions, right? Early in my career, I had to design technical and tactical sessions to not only improve the skill of a player, but improve the tactical awareness of an entire team. Now, taking that and bringing that into what's known as tactical periodization, very popular in the European soccer model, how can we leverage that philosophy into our rehab, into our performance training to bring it all together? Because if you're not familiar with tactical periodization, which we'll get into at the end, there's questions about if there's even a place for a gym or a weight room in some coaches' locker rooms, if they believe. There's stories of certain coaches, putting locks on the gym because they didn't believe it was important, or they could get what they needed on the field. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So let's talk about these key variables that we mentioned earlier. So each one of these variables that you see, we're going to break them down. You can manipulate one of them, you can manipulate 2 of them, or you can manipulate multiple. My recommendation is always start with one. You always start with one because then that gives you like the scientific method. You have an intervention, you want to measure pre-outcome, pre-testing, post-testing, you want to see what the outcome is. So for example, if you have an ankle sprain and you want to manipulate the court space of a drill that's being completed on, well, first you start small. You measure swelling the next day. If there was no changes in swelling, okay, increase the court space. Maybe they can tolerate more load. Maybe they can tolerate more distance, right? So start with one, But then you can slowly, as you get better at this, more creative with it, if you have a little bit more basketball knowledge than most, maybe you already know how to manipulate 2 or 3 of these at the same time. That's fantastic. So let's break each one of these down. So court space is very, very to the point. Are you going to play in smaller spaces or are you going to play in bigger spaces? So common language that I've used in the past is, hey, we're going to stay within the perimeter. Or if you're a big, you're going to stay within the paint. So that would be considered smaller spaces. And then the next progression of that is, hey, we're going to play around the perimeter or just outside the perimeter, or the 4-point line is very popular in the NBA. So that's kind of a slightly step above from small spaces. And then you have your half court progression. So doing things within the half court, and then you have your full court progressions. So each one of those, by increasing the space, we're going to get into what that does physically, but you can manipulate just that one variable to change the volume or intensity of certain key metrics, whether that's number of XLs, decels, whether that's number of total distance, max velocity. Just by manipulating that one variable, you can really change all the physical demands that you want to gain out of it. So then the number of players. The simplest way to look at the number of players is the smaller the amount of square footage or square yardage or square meters per player, the more strength base it's going to be. The larger that square footage is per player, more aerobic base it's going to be. So for example, when we're talking just physical, if I'm playing 1v1 in the half court, that means there's, I don't know the exact math here, but we got 93 by, I don't know, 20, 30, 25, 30 feet. And so each player roughly has half of a half court to themselves. But now you double that, you have 2v2. Well, now that shrinks even more. You go 3v3. Now the square footage per player shrinks even more. So if you think about the number of players is going to influence how much space certain players are going to be able to move in and out of. Also, the more players you add, the higher the cognitive demands or the more the tactical strategies come into play. So that's how you can manipulate that. Contact versus non-contact, pretty straightforward. Typically, we start non-contact to make sure the athlete or the player is ready to handle some non-contact, because contact is unpredictable, a little more chaotic. Non-contact, a little bit more controlled, a little more predictable. Anticipatory versus reactive control, that kind of goes hand in hand with contact versus non-contact. When you're doing non-contact, there's a lot of anticipatory or pre-planned action that you're going to do. Hey, you're going to pass you the ball. You're going to do a dribble handoff at the perimeter, and then you're going to kick it out to the corner, and then you're going to drive to the hoop. Okay, so you're going to do certain actions as planned. Or reactive would be, which is often like a game-like situations or 1v1 situations, especially in defending, you have to react to your opponent in front of you or react to the coach's command. So relative to maybe a non-contact drill, reactive control would be, you tell the player there's one of 3 play calls I'm going to give you. You're going to start, dribbling the ball. You're going to start going through it. I'm going to give a play call. You have to react to it. It just increases the cognitive demand. But then if you flip it on the defensive side, that's usually where a lot more reactive activities come from. Then you talk about your type of opponent. So no opponents, okay, 1-on-0 versus going against coaches. Coaches have a little bit more control. They're aware of what the player may be doing versus players. We don't want either player thinking about, we just want them to hoop. So that's how we manipulate the type of opponent within these variables. Then you have the density of weekly sessions and volume of daily sessions. So what that's referring to is we have to look at the end goal of what the player is going to have to do. Meaning, if you're an NBA player, you're going to have to be on your feet playing 3 games a week with 3 additional practices. So you have to be on your feet about 6 days out of the 7 days, roughly speaking. So your rehab or your return to play criteria has to hit that. It can't be go progress, take 2 days off, go progress, take 2 days off. That's not realistic, because sometimes what happens is just the density of those sessions, the body has to get accustomed to doing that again. And then the volume of your daily sessions. So maybe you're starting at 30 minutes per rehab session on court. Then you bump it up to 40, then you bump it up to 50, then you bump it up to 60. Now all of a sudden you're at a full team practice. So that's how you can manipulate those as well. So any one of these variables that we just went through can be manipulated in tandem, progressed or regressed individually. It's always within your wheelhouse, within your environment. So this is the continuum of rehab. And if you've tuned into some of these webinars before, if you followed some of the articles on the website, you've heard me reference this. And this is a way for us to communicate and understand where an athlete is. And so when you think about health, therapy, training, performance, sport, right, on any given day, any athlete, regardless of rehab, exists in one of these categories. Okay, health, you're trying to restore homeostasis. Therapy is typically your early rehab, heart cath strategies. Training, kind of like your GPP, return to functional activities. Performance, you're starting to chase some cool outputs. And then sport eventually is that controlled chaos or that chaos as well. So anytime, it's important that we recognize where the athlete is. And then more importantly, if you work in a team setting or if you work a part of a university setting and there's multiple providers a part of the plan of care, it's recognizing who's the expert within each one of these categories. So it's very important that we understand this, because this is a great way for us to communicate amongst practitioners, also recognize specific goals that are needed during each phase. So it's just a simple way for us to all work together and communicate, rather than saying, hey, athletic trainers and doctors do this, physical therapists do this, performance coaches do this. It's more so thinking who's the best expert for this player during this point in time. And so we can think about that way to get a little bit better and a little bit ahead of the communication, which we've talked about in previous webinars, is often a sticking point and or friction point. So this is the Control Chaos Continuum. This is a popular research article that has been circulating in the physical therapy and high performance world the last, I'd say, 12 to 18 months. It originally started in soccer, and then there's been additions for in basketball as well. So I encourage you to take a screenshot of this. Also, I believe it's available for download through BGSM, free access typically. I've been able to find it. So feel free to check it out. But again, this is really talking about these high control all the way down to high chaos. So the previous slide, we talked about recognizing the continuum of rehab. Well, this is a very similar approach, but now we're starting to just talk specifically about sport. So when we start talking about sport in and of itself, you may hear folks that work in high performance say, yeah, sport is just controlled chaos, meaning the control is the certain rules of the game. So in basketball, you play on a full court, you play 5v5, you have a round ball, and you got to put the ball in the hoop to score. Okay, that's the control. The rest is just chaos, how the players interact, the fouls that happen, the reactivity that happens. Like that's the chaos of it. That's just the sport in nature. So now we start planning out a rehab session. We want to start as much control as possible. Remember, we were talking on one of the variables, we talked about anticipatory versus reactive, pre-planned versus unplanned. And so we want to be high control, planned activities. Athlete knows what they're doing, you know what they're doing, and that's how we start to introduce the sport. So what might that look like? That might be as simple as stationary catch and shoot. Okay, or it might be, hey, you're giving them an exact play call of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, maybe 3 dribbles, and then they're putting up a jump shot, right? So a lot of control where really the only option is to execute that task that you're asking them to do. And then each one of these, as you progress towards high chaos, is just increasing the complexity of a variety of variables. So very similar to how we just talked about some key variables that you can manipulate, I simplified this into those variables for you. But this gets into the weeds a little bit deeper. So if you're interested more in those variables, I encourage you to double click into this, check out the research. But the big take home point here is this. Early rehab, you want to have as simple activity as possible with the least complexity. As you progress towards getting them back to play, you have to start to introduce more complexity from technical, tactical, cognitive load. And that's where manipulating all those variables on the previous slides, that's how you can start to do that. So at first, maybe you only manipulate one, but then as you kind of go middle phase, maybe it's 2 or 3. And as you get to high chaos, you're kind of manipulating everything at once. So this is the 3P principle, number 7. In previous webinars, we talked about the 3P framework. There's a great article on my website where I break it down even more. This is the framework that guides a lot of my decision-making process within performance therapy. This comes from taking a lot of continuing education, a lot of conversation with mentors, a lot of iPhone notes, and just putting what happens up in here in my head. Like many of you here, you have a model, you have a framework, and I put it to paper. And so one of the key principles of the 10 is prioritize and simplify. And what I mean by that is you just saw how complex that framework can be. So let's just prioritize and pick one variable, simplify, make it super simple. So what I like to do is I like to think about, okay, if I think about all the variables that are possible, how can I just make it as simple as possible and just progress them one at a time? So the way I like to think about this is keep it binary. Okay, we want to progress intensity before we progress volume, stationary before dynamic, and as you go down this list, you see how we just do this before that, right? Make it very binary at first to learn your own framework and model around drill selection and progressions. And then as you get more creative, more experience with it, maybe you can progress 1 or 2 of these. So let's break down each one of these briefly. The reason I like to go intensity before volume is I want to make sure the athlete has the capacity, both physically, emotionally, and technically, to handle the intensity they're going to be exposed to. So this might be, you're going to do one all-out effort of driving to the hoop, non-contact. Then you're going to get rest. And whenever you're ready, you get to go again. Not really concerned about cardiorespiratory response, not really concerned about how many you get. I just want you to be exposed to high intensity XL, decel as you're driving to the hoop. Then as you get more comfortable with this, their symptoms aren't persistent the next day, then okay, now we're going to put some time components on this. Now you got to get X amount in this amount of time, or we're going to put a heart rate strap on it. Now we're going to monitor your heart rate, and you get to go when your heart rate drops below a certain threshold, maybe 140 or 150. Okay, you're going to go again. And the reason I like to do that is I'd rather make sure you can handle the magnitude before we start layering with fatigue, because once you layer in fatigue, things start to change. We all know that. Biomechanics change, skill level changes. So that's how I go about it. Then I like to say stationary before dynamic. This is pretty straightforward. Do standing jump shots before you start doing 1, 2 dribble pull-ups. Why is that? Stationary is easier than more dynamic. Contact, excuse me, I meant to flip this here. Non-contact before contact. Why is that? Non-contact, more pre-planned, less chaotic. Contact, a little bit less planned, definitely more chaotic. Smaller spaces before bigger spaces. This kind of doubles down on this idea of intensity before volume. And we're going to break it down in a few slides here as to why that is. But I prefer to go smaller spaces and tackle strength and acceleration before I start tackling higher velocities and overall total distance. Staff before players, because staff have more control over what they do than players. And then single skill efforts before multiple skill efforts. And that just, again, goes more to the cognitive demand as well. So this is one of my favorite graphics that I love to share. And this comes back, man, this got to be, I don't know, 2013. So over, a decade old, and it still rings true. And this comes from my time working in professional soccer. And that's why the language around this is soccer, but the principle is still the same. So on the y-axis here on the left-hand side, you have the number of players. On the x-axis here on the bottom, you have the space. So as you can see, as you increase the space, so as we go increase the space and increase the numbers, going from the bottom left to the top right, we change the physical characteristics of a drill from more strength and acceleration and anaerobic based towards more aerobic endurance and higher velocities. And so just by manipulating the variable, these two variables, numbers and size of the space, you change the physical demands. So why is that? Well, when you're playing in tight spaces, 1v1, 2v2, you don't have opportunity to accumulate total distance. You don't have opportunity to accelerate beyond 20, 30 yards to be able to hit a top speed. Everything is stop start, just like in basketball. That's a big component of what basketball is. Now, as you progress to bigger spaces, so in the context of basketball, maybe your middle ground tier is your 3v3 in the half court, and maybe your complete aerobic side is your 5v5 in the full court. So by just, as you can see, it's just a nice graphic to represent what happens when you manipulate numbers and what happens when you manipulate space, and how that impacts energy system development, how that impacts certain physical adaptations. So for example, the best way you could use this graphic is if you're in a strength block or an acceleration block in the training room and in the weight room, we really should only be doing tight spaces and 1v1, 2v2 on court. If you're trying to work on capacity, or if you're trying to work on high velocity exposures, right, sprint speed, well, we probably should be playing a lot more full court activities because that coincides with what we're doing on court. Now, there's an expression I like to use: keep your stressors the same on the same day. So if you're trying to do a mixed bag throughout the rehab, make sure that you're aligning what you're doing in your training and treatment room with what you expect to do on the court. Because if you don't, now all of a sudden this athlete's kind of getting everything every single day. Do they have an opportunity to recover? Probably not. It's not the most optimal way to go about it. So this graphic is a great way. Again, take a screenshot of it, save it. You can certainly manipulate it for basketball, but the principle is the same. Numbers and spaces are what we're after. Just like we can leverage reps and sets in the weight room or the training room, I just wanted to highlight how this classic graphic that we're all familiar with in strength and conditioning, even in the rehab world, right? When you manipulate certain variables of reps versus sets, it targets different physical adaptations. The same rings true, like you just saw on the previous slide. When you manipulate space and numbers, not necessarily sets and reps, but you manipulate space and numbers, you get different physical adaptations. So the same principles that we're used to in strength and conditioning and physical therapy can be applied on court as well. So here's some simple breakdowns and some simple progressions that I've used in the past. It's not an exact science. It's not perfect, but these are ways that we can leverage some of those variables that we talked about. So we make it dichotomous here: a 5-stage progression of non-contact, then transition to a 5-stage progression of contact. On the left-hand side, from number 1 to number 5, you see that you're going more stationary, easy, small spaces, and you start to progress each one of these to more movement. Now, a question in the past, I'm like, what's the Mikan drill? And I apologize for not explaining this. The Mikan drill, if you're not familiar, is you imagine standing underneath the hoop and you're just doing a right-handed layup and a left-handed layup back and forth. And you can progress that to being away from the hoop. So now it's like a 1 or 2 dribble into a layup, immediately come underneath the hoop, run to the other side, another 1-2 dribble. So it's just repeated finishes, and you can manipulate how far away you are from the hoop. Now you may be asking, like, what benefit does that have here? Well, if you think about it, you're going, number 1, you're staying still with no jumping. Number 2, you're staying still and catch and shoot, but you're adding a jump. Number 3, you're adding some movement, and now you're also adding a jump. Number 4, you're having repeated aerobic plyometrics. That's what a Mikan drill is: single leg, repeated extensive plyometrics. And then you have 1 on no script. Now you're just adding more total distance, more volume of running before you start getting into some more intense activities over on contact. On the contact side, one-on-one, all the way up to 5 number game minutes. Each one of those is progressing intensity and progressing volume based on the number of players, based on the size of the court that they're playing on. And so this is how you can see how some of these variables that we're talking about start to tie together from a rehab progression perspective. And now if you think about off the court exercise selection, again, I love to keep things simple and just go do this before that, do this before that. And these are just examples of some simple principles that we can follow. So this first line here is just talking about linear running. So I love to do marching before resisted being sled pushes, before dribbles or A-skips, dribbles popularized by the group Altus out here in Phoenix. Then you have assisted running, which is typically a little bit of your overspeed or into your decels. And then obviously you have sprinting as the pinnacle of that. So just some simple ways. Hey, do this before that. You have single effort attempts before multiple effort attempts. When you're talking about strength training, I like to go isometric before tempo, before dynamic. And then when you're talking about actions, I love to see anticipatory before reactive. These variables, these simple progressions, are what you can leverage inside the weight room or inside the training room that coincide with what you're doing on the court. This is another great graphic. We're talking here a little bit more about research. And now, so far, we've been talking a lot about just drill design, exercise design, more physical outputs. But it's important we talk about the physiological response. And so this is a research article that looked at different types of basketball activities. On the left-hand side, it progresses from friendly matches all the way down to 1v1. And this is in basketball. This type of research is very, very common, has been established in the soccer culture and the Aussie rules football and rugby, where they look at a lot of GPS drills and heart rate monitoring. They looked what types of drills elicit what type of response. This was something I had to do on a regular basis working as a sports scientist in Major League Soccer. And so what we see here is just look at the first column, heart rate average. And as you can see, the heart rate average, the highest heart rate average is during the friendly matches. The highest peak heart rate is during the friendly matches. And then as you progress down towards 1v1, you slowly see the heart rate average on a downward trajectory. Same thing with heart rate peak. And then same thing with percentage. Now, let's be very clear. It's not perfect. It's not saying 5v5 will always be better than 3v3. There's always, intent. There's always little rules in a game that you can certainly increase. So for example, you can make a 5v5 very slow if you say, hey, you have to walk the drill up, you have to walk the ball up every time from baseline. Or you could say, hey, you have an 18-second shot clock, right? So rules within the game definitely manipulate the physiological adaptation. But this is just a segue to say, hey, when we think about the heart rate response, here's some evidence that suggests different types of drills and different types of game setups elicit a different heart rate response. So this is how we can also start to leverage, if you want to monitor heart rate, if you want to leverage that as a metric that you want to monitor, a KPI, here's some information that you can use that coincides with some of the other previous progression we talked about, right? So if you think about internal heart rate response, yes, 1v1 maybe acceleration and strength based. Yeah, we probably shouldn't see a high aerobic output there if we're trying to work on strength and acceleration. But in 5v5, we're trying to work on high velocity and aerobic. Yeah, we want to see our heart rate elevated. So this is a great reference for you here to support more of what we've been talking about. And then this is a classic, energy system graphic where we talk about the three primary of alactic, anaerobic, and aerobic. And so each one of these, we see the typical time variables of 10 to 12 seconds alactic, 60 to 90 anaerobic lactic, and then hours on the aerobic side. And I just want to call out and highlight that, as you can see, all three circles overlap. It's never just this stop here, start there, right? They're always working together. It's just the volume and intensity of your drill that's going to indicate what energy system is going to be most dominant, but they're always constantly working in tandem. So if we think about the previous slide around heart rate response to certain drills, and we think about what we're trying to accomplish from a lot of what we do in the weight room or the training room on bikes or treadmills or sled work, well, what we're very good at is energy system development outside of the court. Well, now think about how can you apply those same principles of work to rest ratios to target certain qualities that you want on court. And what that does is twofold. One, it integrates you with the coaching staff seamlessly, but it also ties in the technical and tactical piece, and you're just layering in a little bit of the physical adaptation too. So what might that look like? Well, if you're trying to work on 1v1 and work on acceleration and strength, and that would fit with an alactic energy system, well, each repetition probably should putter out somewhere around 10 to 12 seconds. And this is important. This is an important concept for coaches to learn, meaning skill coaches, is sometimes they just put a practice plan and they're like, hey, we're going to make sure we work hard today. But they're just constantly going one activity after the other. And then you think about, well, this was more of an aerobic workout than it was true strength workout. So this is where you get to educate coaches and have a conversation and say, hey, we're really working on max strength in the weight room because that's one of our KPIs for return to play. We want to see him or her hit 1.5 body weight on a squat. We're really pushing this strength adaptation in the weight room. It'd be fantastic if we could complement that on the court by doing short, intense efforts of maybe 10 to 12 seconds, give adequate rest, maybe 30, 40 seconds, let them recover, and then do it again. Now, that's difficult for coaches sometimes to understand or implement because they just want to go. But it's important that we leverage this type of information so that way we can integrate with each other, and ultimately that's what's best for the athlete. So tactical periodization, you heard me mention this in previous slides and earlier at the start of this. And so what tactical periodization is this concept of integrating the technical, tactical, physical, and emotional. There's a great podcast episode I did recently with Dave Tenney, who completed his PhD program through the Portuguese Vitor Frade school. And so I encourage you to listen to that if you have any more interest on tactical periodization. But the big take-home message I want you to understand here is when we think about rehab, we often think about the physical side. Some of us are thinking about the emotional side and the cognitive side, and we recognize that that's part of it, right? We love to say the biopsychosocial model. We love to use it. I don't see many people implementing at a high level, right? So tactical periodization in a team setting is a way for us to do it at a high level. And this integrates everything we've been talking about, right? Technically, you think about, okay, the complexity of what I'm asking them to do. Am I asking them to do form shooting, or am I asking them to run some sort of script and play? I think about the tactical side. Am I asking them to do just 1v1, or am I asking them to do 5v5? The physical side. Am I asking them to do in the half court or in the full court? The emotional side. Am I putting any sort of reward at the end of this? Am I putting any sort of punishment at the end of this? Is there emotional investment from the athlete? Do they even like doing what you're asking them to do? That's a very, very underrated and underutilized perspective, is that we can create the best drills that we want. But if the player isn't emotionally invested or doesn't like it, they're not going to put the best effort forward. So sometimes it's also working with the player and recognizing, hey, what do you enjoy? Like, what's going to motivate you? This is what I need physically. This is why I need this physically. This is what we're doing on the rehab side. What is it on court that you think is going to work well with this? And you'd be surprised, especially an educated player that's played the game for a while. Maybe it's a college player, maybe it's a senior in high school, maybe the younger players not so much, but you'd be surprised, I think, if you put the onus on them and you explain what you're trying to get out of them, and now all of a sudden they have so much more buy-in because they have skin in the game. So I encourage you to expand our thought on the traditional biopsychosocial and dig deeper into tactical periodization. So tactical periodization, again, this is from a soccer perspective, but this is where we can leverage some of this inside a rehab plan. So if we think about first off, let me back up here. Let me explain some of the lingo here. And the red on either side is MD. MD stands for match day. And then as you work towards the middle of this, you see a minus and a plus. So if you play on the far right, let's say that's a Saturday, that's considered match day. Then the day after a game is always considered match day +1, then match day +2, match day +3. And then as you hit match day -3, that's like you're working towards the game. So it's this language where we're trying to make sure that what we're doing following a match is helping them help recover, but then prepare them for the rest of the week, but then also not kill them before the game and make sure we're tapering off. And so the reason I bring this up within this conversation and within this webinar is that we have to think what's coming down the pipeline. And what I mean by that is you have to understand what the journey is you're taking this athlete through during the return to play. So if your goal is ultimately to get them back on the court, at some point, they're going to do a lot of these on-court progressions, and recognizing that these on-court progressions in and of themselves may be the most important thing, if not the most important thing. And so we're preparing for what that is. If you know in 3 days, hey, I think we're going to be ready to push, 2v2 within the perimeter, then the day before, those 24 to 48 hours beforehand, better be preparing them to be physically ready to handle that stress on that day. If you're hitting a high intensity strength day or a high intensity velocity day the day before you're trying to progress something on court, it's not going to be a fair shakeup. They're going to probably struggle. They're going to be beat up from what you did in the weight room or in the training room. So this is how a tapering strategy, if you know in 3 days time you're trying to make some progression on court because that's what's important, make sure what we're doing in the training room or weight room is tapering towards that, so that way they're rested and recover and give you the best effort. Because nothing's more frustrating than you think they're ready to handle on court, but then all of a sudden they're just not recovered or ready for it. And now all of a sudden we have this false sense of their current status on court. Whereas if you did give them 24 to 40 hours of tapering, they may actually surprise a lot of us. And oftentimes they do when what their capabilities are on the court. So just reference this as an idea of how can I, when I periodize my rehab plan and I'm trying to progress certain qualities, am I tapering leading into it? And am I getting the adequate recovery the day after, right? So that's how we can leverage something like this. So let's talk about practical application, designing an on-court rehab progression. Let's go step by step here and kind of tie everything together. So first thing we want to do is define the target for our physical quality. Are you going after strength? Are you going after acceleration or deceleration? Do you want more of an aerobic adaptation? Once you have that, remember principle number 7 from 3P, prioritize and simplify. Once you have your target physical quality, then the next step in this is to determine, okay, what's the right drill variables that are going to elicit this type of response? I think the easiest one to always start with is space. If you're trying to go strength, should be small space. If you're trying to go aerobic, should be big space. And then what we want to do is manipulate 1 or 2 other variables to make sure you kind of fine tune exactly what it is, create some rules around the game potentially with the coach to really hone in on that physical quality. Then step 3 is aligning what we're doing in the weight room and the training room. So if you've created that drill, you've had that conversation with the coach or the player, and you know exactly what you're going to do on the court. Well, let's make sure that fits and is running alongside the goals or the return to play criteria within the training room and weight room. Okay, and we're going to go over what that may look like here shortly. And then the final thing is just make sure we're progressing these drills by progressing each variable or multiple variables at a time to slowly introduce more chaos. Remember, think back to the earlier slide around the control chaos framework. Introduce more chaos because ultimately that's what sport is. So here is a simple chart that I created a few years ago when I was just thinking, okay, how can I start to maybe replace drills with sport? And what I mean by this is I do believe when you're in the team setting or you're working with athletes that have access to the court regularly, I'm always thinking, how can I do less and allow others to do more? And what I mean by that is I'm not passing the buck. What I'm saying is I necessarily don't have to check every single box myself, because if we're intelligent with what we're doing on the court, we can check some of those boxes indirectly. And what I mean by that, the classic example I love to use is when we think about, sometimes in basketball, not sometimes, most of the time during a basketball return to play, there's some phase of extensive plyometrics or aerobic plyometrics to prepare tendons, to accept load, to just introduce ground contact. And so I asked myself a while back, do I need to have an extensive aerobic plyo framework? Yes, I do. And isn't that the same thing as just doing 20 minutes of jump shots out on the court? So now all of a sudden I can allow, or I can encourage a coach or an athlete, hey, go get 20 to 30 minutes of jump shots. That's extensive plyometrics that they're getting that I would traditionally do in the weight room. And now all of a sudden they're doing that. And now my time's freed up where I can maybe focus on some isolated strength. I can focus on another motor skill. And so now we can share the responsibilities if we understand exactly what it is. So the way this chart works is it's a general progression. It's not perfect science. It's what has made sense to me in the past and has given me success. And so from stage 1 all the way down to stage 10, this is progressions of, you think about running in the linear vector, change the direction in the lateral vector, and then basketball progressions. Now, general rule of thumb that I have with this chart, and feel free to take a photo of this and save it, is we should never be plus or minus 2 away from each other. And what I mean by that is if you're in stage 3 on running, you should be somewhere between stage 1 and stage 5 on the other 2 variables, ideally plus or minus 1, if not the same. But we shouldn't be working on, band resisted running, but we're doing anticipatory drills for change of direction. Like, that doesn't match up. The variables and the stress are different. So that's a way we can start to leverage this. And I encourage you, maybe some of these drills resonate with you, maybe some of them don't, but I encourage you to write down, hey, if I was to progress someone on basketball based, everything I learned here today, here's my stage 1 through stage 10. Okay, great. How would I progress a jumping? How would I progress sprinting? How would I progress change of direction? And now just try to match up your drills or your exercises with what they're going to do on the court. And then ask yourself, do I know enough and do I have a great enough relationship with the player, the parent, the coach to communicate what I need physically to now all of a sudden the coach can take care of some of it on court while they're integrating the skill, while they're integrating the tactical side of it. And I think that is very powerful because you get buy-in from the coach, you get buy-in from the player, and you look like a rock star because you get them on the court sooner. So this is how we can leverage this to enhance our abilities to integrate the court with the training, with the weight room. So here's a case study, very high level. I'm not going to get into the weeds on it, but this is someone that was going through ACL surgery, basketball player. And we're going to jump in here at months 4 or 5. Months 0 through 3 is really surgery recovery, functional patterns, and just making sure they were safe to tolerate some of these other things. So months 4 and 5, each one, sorry, let me back up here. Each one of these month breakdowns, we talk about something that's going on in the weight room, potentially something that's going on in the training room, and then on court. So months 4 or 5, we're working on squat strength, okay, the ability to produce force and absorb force. We're also layering just low volume, extensive plyometrics, but a little bit of capacity, and then that ties in nicely with spot shooting, okay, just catch and shoot. Month 5, 6, we moved over to more overcoming isometrics from a weight room perspective, more intensive plyometrics to match up with the intensity of those isometrics. And then we also progress to some 1v1 with coaches, right? Working on acceleration, deceleration. So just see how these variables, they're not perfect. They're not perfectly synonymous with one another, but it would make sense to do 1v1 alongside intensive and overcoming isometrics versus 1v1 alongside aerobic plyometrics and strength. You see how there could be some crossover. You could easily add squat strength into month 5 or 6, but for the sake of this progression, this is what we did. Then month 6, 7, as we start to integrate more volume, more changes of direction, it was important that we also build up those local tissue qualities with yielding isometrics. And so that's what we did there from a weight room perspective. From a conditioning, we added tempo runs because there is just a capacity of needing to regain that capacity. And by doing tempo runs, you also get the eccentric component of stop, start, right? Having a turn around. If you're running full court down and back, there's an eccentric component as you decelerate, and there's an eccentric component with every step that you take. And then we layered that with 3v3 in the half court to increase some of the deceleration that we wanted. And then month 7, 8, okay, recovery modalities. What I mean by recovery modalities is, yes, recovery modalities could exist throughout all of this. What I mean by this, though, is month 7, 8, the primary goal here is high intensity efforts with sprint training and 5v5 full court. The days in between or the time afterwards needs to be focused on recovering and getting ready for the next session to recover from those high stressors, right? And so that's where I say leveraging recovery modalities. And we often think recovery modalities right after surgery, right after injury, and then we don't really touch them until, maybe they're back playing. But it's important that we highlight as someone starts to ramp up their workload, ramp up their on-court workload, it's like it's like a progression for them that they haven't had in a while. So this is where we can leverage some of those modalities to encourage the recovery and enhance their adaptations during this phase. So here's our summaries and takeaways from today, right? I think I hammered home drill design and exercise design kind of working in tandem. Understand what your adaptation you're chasing physically from a rehab perspective, and then manipulate the right variables to create the appropriate drill that targets the same sort of physical adaptation. And then it's very, very important. We didn't talk much about it. We didn't highlight much of it, but I want to remind you, density of sessions is so important. If you have an athlete that's going to have to be on their feet 4 or 5, 6 days a week, or they're going to have to play 1, 2, or 3 games a week, you have to be able to prepare them for that type of density. You have to have your high days. You have to have your low days. And I've seen this happen. I've made the mistake where you make this perfect progression of rehab. You make this perfect progression of training room and intensities, but you forgot the element of can they do it over and over and over again over the course of 7 days, 14 days. And so that's where you hear a lot of information out there around minute progressions or minute restrictions in the NBA or the college setting. All that is saying is we're trying to build, like they're literally doing everything possible with the team. They're doing all the team practices. They're flying with the team. They're doing all their individual sessions. We're just slowly ramping up the volume, but they're maintaining their density. So that's what those game minutes really are. It's just manipulating the density and the volume of their sessions. So by mastering all of these variables, we can really influence the rehab process. And you as a provider, whether you're a performance coach, a high school coach, an athletic trainer, you now have the ability to communicate what it is that you're doing on the rehab side and get them back on the court sooner, but also bring them back intelligently, because nothing's worse than you do a fantastic job and all of a sudden they have a re-injury, 1 or 2 days back on the court. That's never fun for anybody. So this is how we can integrate and progress together. So a huge thank you for joining me. Again, if you did not download the handout, it's over here on the right-hand side. Please download it. Plenty of topics that we talked about today. You can scroll through some of the podcast episodes. A lot of information there. Like I said, Dave Tenney did a fantastic job talking about tactical periodization. I've had a few NBA guests on there as well, talking about rehab from sports science to load management. On the website, plenty of deep dive articles for you as well. Trying to do a better job on social, put some more information out there. So those of you that have been leaving the feedback, I appreciate that. And then ultimately, all of this information that you learned today is broken down even more in the greatest detail in my performance therapy mentorship, which we have more cohorts coming in the summer and fall. So if any of those are interested in you, by all means, please check them out. But hey, the floor is yours now. Please ask away. We already have a question coming in here, so love to see it. Thank you. So the question is, what does a microcycle look like if there are a few days in between game days? That's a fantastic question. And the question I would have to put back on you is, well, what did they do before that first game day, right? That's the hardest thing to say about any sort of microcycle, is recognizing, well, what did they do on game day? And then what are they doing? How many days in between do they have? So let's just arbitrarily say you play on a Saturday, your next game is on a Wednesday. Well, if you think about the tactical periodization, you have Saturday's game day. Well, ideally your first 48 hours of recovery. And then potentially you have maybe a potentiation on match day +3, but then you're hitting the game right away. And microcycle is very difficult in the sense, as I've learned, less is more. And what I mean by that is, if you dive into the literature, and I'm going to speak specifically on the soccer side because I don't think there's been a basketball study yet, but this has been well established in the soccer community and the Aussie rules community. It takes up to 96 hours for inflammatory markers, that being C-reactive protein, cortisol, to come back down to baseline after a game. So that's why in the soccer community, you don't have a high intensity session until 4 days after a game. So that's typically where it's a Wednesday. You literally have one chance to have a high intensity session before your next game. That's if you're on a 7-day cycle. Now, that maybe that's what you're referring to here as a 7-day cycle. If you're looking for a microcycle on a 7-day cycle, just go back to that slide that had the tactical periodization of what the soccer was and look at each one of those variables of how you do it. If you're talking of basketball, which NBA, we used to joke, in the NBA, you really shouldn't practice. Your practice really should just be walkthroughs and tactical. Get off your feet as much as you can, because when you're playing, every other day, you're playing 3 games in 4 nights. Like, you're just trying to survive. Recovery is the name of the game, and even at that, like, how much can you really recover in 24 hours between games with travel? So I hope that answers the question. But more specifically, I guess I could get here is, if I had a 4-day microcycle of a Saturday to Wednesday, my Sunday would be get off your feet as much as you can. Do as much recovery modalities. That may be, cold plunge, sauna, BFR bike, anything that's just going to promote that parasympathetic state and also give you the metabolic response that can be helpful to help improve circulation. And then my 2 days post, maybe that's a decent, training session where I'm not eliciting soreness, but I'm eliciting some outputs just to tap into it. But again, I'm still 48 hours out from a high intensity effort. Typically, you want to see 48 to 72 hours in between those efforts. And then the day before the game, I'm really not trying to progress too much, trying to taper down again, make sure they're ready for tomorrow, because ultimately you don't want them being sore going into a game. So it's a slippery slope. It's difficult. There's no great answer. But the best thing that I can say is less is more, and focus on what the main thing is, and that is making sure they're ready for the game. That would be my response to that question. I hope that answers it. If not, fire away another one. Again, if you have more questions, feel free to send them here. If you don't have any questions right now, no big deal. You can always reach out over social. We'll give it another couple minutes here. I mean, I'm not in the business of keeping everybody here if there's no questions coming through. So we'll go another 2 minutes here, 50 after the hour, unless more questions come in after that. All right, y'all, no questions coming through here. So we'll wrap things up here. So again, thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar Wednesday edition of how can we integrate on-court rehab with off-court rehab. I hope you walked away with some practical advice. Again, if you have not, please reach out over social. shoot me a note, shoot me a DM. Happy to answer those questions. If you want to learn more, plenty of resources for you to do that, whether you want to listen, whether you want to read, or whether you want direct mentorship. Those are all available for you. So again, I greatly appreciate your time, your sacrifice of being here. Please download the free handout. That is a simple thank you of saying, I appreciate you joining me today and taking time out of your evening. So without further ado, y'all, I will sign off here, and feel free to join us next month where we'll have a case study around ACL and ALL repair and how it relates to rehab and how we integrate the post-op principles that we often talk about with performance therapy. So stay tuned for next month's webinar. And until then, I'll talk to you soon.